Welcome to the Forest of Thought with me, Ingrid Rieser. First of all, Happy New Year to everyone. For various reasons, I decided that the last episode of this season would not be an interview, but a kind of reflective session, tying together some thoughts on this past year with looking back at some of our episodes and also offering a personal story. So we're in the middle of the very darkest time of the year here in the Northern Hemisphere. And I'm up in middle northern Sweden, and the sun is just skimming the horizon for 5 or 6 hours a day. And to top it off, I think most of Scandinavia has had 4 solid weeks of heavy cloud cover, so our sun exposure is close to zero. But there's something I enjoy about this darkness. It's a good excuse to light a candle, to slow down, to reflect on what this spin around the sun has taught us. And this year has been so turbulent, so transformative and complex that trying to take in and understand what's happening sometimes feels like a full-time job. But making sense of the deeper stories at work in our world and exploring how they're embedded in our web of ideas is the whole point of the podcast. So I thought we'd try to dig into that in this episode. So of course we're continuously telling stories to make sense of what's happening in the world around us. And this year's it's been interesting to see how the story of Corona is being told in different groups in different places. Because Sweden chose a pretty different approach in the first months of the outbreak. Reading international news reporting while living here was extremely interesting because the differences in narrative were pretty radical, even in comparison to Norway, which is Sweden's neighbor and also my home country. Concerned friends from abroad would ask us if we were okay, as if we were living in a war zone. And so there was a total mismatch between national news, international news, and also my own experience. And it made it really clear for me how messy reality is. So how do we make sense of what's happening, especially when different sources give such incongruent accounts? So first of all, I think it's important to note that making sense of history as it's happening is always tricky. I'm guessing that most Romans in the 4th or 5th century didn't realize that they were living at the end of empire, even if the signs were all around them. And when we look at history retrospectively, we pick out certain events and leave out others to begin to discern a pattern that tells us a meaningful story about the past. And then as our culture develops and as regimes change, so will our stories. So a war considered great and necessary by one generation may be ridiculed and reviled by the next generation. Of course, the challenge is that the stories we tell about the present will influence the future, and so these narratives really are very important. So we have to try to make sense of history as it's happening. Otherwise, we're just spectators on the stage of life. But the question is how. And so to further explore this, and also in honor of the winter solstice that just passed, I wanted to tell you a story about a journey and about lighting candles in the dark. So about a year ago, I was carrying a candle along the narrow tunnels of the Pechersk Lavra in Kiev, Ukraine. In English, it's known as the Monastery of Caves. Above ground, it's a collection of churches and bell towers in Ukrainian Baroque style. Underground, it's a network of catacombs dug into the hillside. We walked along the dark tunnels that opened out onto small chapels and places of prayer, and along long hallways with interred monks in glass-paneled chests, resting on alcoves dug into the rock walls. For more than a millennium, monks have lived here, praying in the dark. My great-grandparents are from Ukraine, And that was the reason I was there with my sister and my mother at the end of 2019. We made the long journey by train and by ferry and visited the capital Kiev in the north and Odessa on the Black Sea coast in the south. It was the most emotionally trying vacation I've been on, and no, not because I was traveling with my family, but because the history of Ukraine this past century carries so many uncomfortable truths about the indifference and the evils that humans are capable of misuse of power and of arrogance, especially in the name of ideology. It also taught me how much our stories about the past are dependent on our stories about the present and how quickly those can change. So the day after seeing the monastery, we visited the museum commemorating the hunger famine that ravaged the Soviet Union in the 1930s. In Ukraine, they call it the Holodomor, the terror famine, and there it has been classified as a genocidal, man-made famine. And Ukraine was long known as Europe's breadbasket, with deep black soils perfect for growing grain. But Stalin's collectivization of agriculture in the first 5-year plan, and also forcing peasants to give up grains for export rather than feed themselves, led to widespread starvation. The estimated death tolls range from 3 to 12 million. And yet, the first museum commemorating this tragedy in the Ukraine wasn't built until 75 years after the famine, because the Kremlin worked so hard to keep it a secret from the world. According to our guide, almost everyone in Ukraine had family members who perished in the famine, but there was no room to publicly discuss the traumas of seeing their loved ones die, of fighting others for food, or of having to eat bark or even human flesh to survive. The children of the famine have now passed away or are grandparents today, but the effects of trauma still ripple through generations, especially when the wound is prevented from being exposed to the healing power of the light and sun. And part of the reason that the foreign press was so slow to expose the famines of 1932 to 33 was that many still hoped that the Soviet Union would be the successful experiment and workers' paradise that it had set out to become, hoped that the rumors that they had heard were not true. And it makes me wonder what stories we're willing to tell. Are we willing to tell and listen to the stories that are true, even if they don't support our cause or fit our image at the moment? One of the journalists who eventually succeeded in spreading news of the famine abroad was Welsh reporter Gareth Jones. His clandestine trip through Ukraine by foot made him witness to terrible conditions and widespread starvation. And despite the attempts to discredit Jones, his reports from Ukraine actually inspired George Orwell to write Animal Farm, the famous parable about what happens when all animals are deemed equal, but some animals are deemed more equal than others. On our third day in Kiev, we piled onto our tour bus, armed with our passports and long-sleeved shirts and pants. The passports in order to be able to enter the Chernobyl exclusionary zone, and the long-sleeved shirts supposedly to protect us from the radiation. Our faces, however, for some reason did not need to be covered. And the drive was pretty quick. Kiev is closer to Chernobyl than I thought. The stunning autumn weather and golden leaf trees were clashing painfully with the terrible things that the guide was telling us about the nuclear catastrophe. Walking around the deserted town of Pripyat with its abandoned go-karts and Ferris wheel, looted hotels and supermarket, the overgrown football pitch, what really got to me was how bright the future must have seemed to its inhabitants right up until the very minute of the blast. Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich has said that doing interviews for her book, Voices from Chernobyl, was easier than any other in the rest of her career, because in her other books, such as those on World War II and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there were strong official narratives that seemed to impinge on her interviewees' ability to speak from their personal felt experience. Regarding Chernobyl, there was no narrative. There was just a vacuum, a lid placed on the whole thing. And it gave the interview subjects no clues as to what was the right way to talk about what had happened. And so their private memories and personal stories could surface more easily. It makes me think of the constant interplay between our own experiences and the societal or the public story. How do they commingle? Which stories are considered valid and which are discarded? Back in Kiev, we walked along the main boulevard, Grushadik Street. It was bombed to pieces during the Second World War, but was rebuilt in neoclassical Stalinist style. In Ukraine, it's so clear how our changing narratives about society also transform the landscape. So during the Soviet era, many of Kiev's churches were demolished. Others were turned into museums as a reminder of a fanatical past that no one wants to return to. Now, since 2015, communist symbols are outlawed in Ukraine and have been scrubbed from the landscape. Every statue of Lenin has been removed, except for one in Chernobyl and another in Odessa that has actually recast Lenin as Darth Vader, complete with a Wi-Fi hotspot so you can connect to the Force. Some Soviet monuments and buildings have been preserved as reminders of a dangerous and fanatical past that no one wants to return to. Walking down Krashadik Street, I saw enormous illuminated signs of names that I recognized. Zara, Samsung, Finbank. What stories will we tell about this time in the future? I wondered. If you continue along this wide street, you eventually end up at Maidan Square, the plaza with an underground shopping mall that hosted 2 revolutions since 2004. This part of Ukrainian history is so recent that its story is still being worked through and woven together. A museum commemorating the latest revolution has been planned but not built. The war with Russia that followed in the revolution's wake is in a tenuous ceasefire, and it has divided Ukrainians. Our guide Tatiana tells us that many families are no longer on speaking terms because they find themselves on opposite sides of the political conflict. At Maidan, the memorials to those slain in the war are makeshift brick alcoves with pictures of the fallen propped up inside. In both revolutions, Ukrainians were protesting political corruption and demanding a better future for their country. My understanding is that in both cases, the politicians and elites failed them. It's not easy being a borderland. That's what the word Ukraine really means. It's a country wedged in between 2 empires. And I imagine that makes it even harder to ensure that true civic engagement of the many isn't twisted and molded to serve the purposes of the powerful few. Making sense of the present and the past is always an exercise in discernment, of picking out some events and leaving out others in order to make a cohesive picture. Just like I've done now, based on my short trip to the Ukraine. My narrative has been that narratives about history will change according to our worldview and values. But let's just be clear. I don't mean that history or truth is relative or that all history is propaganda. Some stories are more truthful than others. I also realize that totalitarian regimes such as the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany will be more ruthless in controlling narratives than most democracies. But I do think we need to be aware that we're always wearing a certain set of glasses when we look at our messy, confusing, complex world, and that it usually does us good to try on several pairs to see what we can see. And to me, the tricky thing about making sense of the present is that we're immersed so deeply in the thick of it, and that discernment is a process that takes time. However, we still have to do our best to see what's happening in real time, to participate in the plotline as it's moving along. Otherwise, we leave too much room for those who would tell the story for us, and in an oversimplified manner too. So how do we get better at doing that? How do we get better at navigating the messiness, making sense of history as it's happening, and adding our voices to the ongoing story? I thought I'd go back to a couple of the conversations I've had during the course of the season to see if we could find some helpful clues. So I've been arguing that the way we tell our stories will be deeply influenced by our values and ideological frameworks. So I wanted to take us back to episode 5, where we talked to human ecologist and historian of ideas, Paddy Johansson, about how ideas work, what ideas really are. Pat explained that he sees ideas as powers with various intensities and impacts. Ideas can stir things in us. They can bring us hope or despair. They can bring us together or tear us apart. And these ideas are always interacting in a kind of drama that's continuously evolving. So let's listen back to part of that conversation and see how it relates to what we've been talking about so far. I was thinking about how ideas have power. Mm-hmm. So they have power to impact, and they can stir things in us. They can awaken desire. They have effect and affect.
May I?
But you're saying they are power.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Maybe you could say something about that distinction.
If you ask yourself, where do ideas live? Mm-hmm. If ideas are power, they are in some sense living entities.
Yes.
Living forces. Where do they live?
In the forest of thought, maybe?
I think the general answer must be they live in us.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could even say that if you ask the question, what is a human being? What do human beings do? Mm-hmm. They harbor ideas. That's what they do. But they not only harbor them, they tend them. Mm. They grow them. Mm. They spread them. Mm. They live them. They are angry at them. They love them. They hate them. If you watch this from the inside within yourself, it becomes all a matter of discernment, of discerning what is what. What kind of power is this idea? How am I affected by this idea? How will this idea affect this or that person or this or that group? That's what we are doing all day. Mm. Some of us consciously, most unconsciously. I said it was a drama. Mm-hmm. So what does this drama consist in? Like everything I've said now, it's kind of a simplification. But the drama is which side will win. Because I think there are sides. If you're speaking of ideas as powers that animate you, that you you yourself contribute to animating, then we're talking about living realities, our living reality. Then it's obvious that different powers, that is different ideas, real ideas, not those wishy-washy sort of non-ideas that also flourish today. Real ideas, which actually arouse feelings, controversies. There are sides. Some ideas are constructive, contribute to good things. Expansion, discovery, adventure, love, whatever. Other ideas are limiting, destructive, ill-willed. So that's what I mean with the drama always going on, both between us and inside each one of us.
Well, it makes me think of a couple of different things. First of all, I mean, I think that some obvious unconstructive ideas that might, or an ill-willed idea might be the idea that a certain group of people should dominate and suppress another group of people, for example.
But the thing is, the tricky thing. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's fine.
The tricky thing is that to understand the import of what I just said regarding ideas being powers or forces and living entities rather than thoughts, just thoughts, is that we are so used to thinking about ideas as thoughts, as statements, things that can be written down or spoken out aloud. That's not what I'm talking about. You must not confuse statements with living ideas. And this is actually obvious if you think that explicit statements are different in different languages. But the power of an idea is independent of the language in which it is someone tries to express it. So the expression you can multiply, you can record it, you can write it down, you can demand obedience or allegiance, but the very life of the idea is its own.
Yeah. Well,
which means that you can have literal expressions which sound like a certain idea. Like the power, if you only stay in your intellectual mind, if you only stay in the statements, you might come to think that the power resides in that statement.
Yes.
But it doesn't.
Right.
It may have, because then the context is very important. The context of the statement. If a statement might sound very good. This is the one who says this is a good person. Maybe he or she even says it because he or she would like to be seen as a good person. But the context within which it is said or written tells you, if you can discern such things, tells you that the context is not as good-natured as it makes itself out to be.
Exactly, and I think that's why people find the act of discernment when it comes to ideas so difficult.
Yes, it is difficult.
And the reason why we're maybe also afraid to be more adventurous in the forest of thought, because things can sound very similar or be expressed very similar, but have a very different source. And it's also very... it's tricky to navigate between. So I think, how do we become better discerners in that case?
By experimenting, by trying things out, trying things on, so to speak.
So maybe part of making sense of the present is also recognizing the idea powers at play, seeing how they're interacting and manifesting. What idea powers are we serving, consciously or unconsciously? I also think the question of becoming better navigators is a central one, and that includes how to separate ideas from their statements. So when I hear fossil fuel companies like Shell talking about their great contribution to sustainability, I understand that despite the eloquent talking points, using all of the right buzzwords, the reality behind those words is very unlikely to be anything good for the climate. But of course, most of the time, sorting statements from ideas is much more complicated than that. So learning through experimentation and trying out different ideas to see what they do. That's Pat's suggestion. Perhaps becoming comfortable with complexity and messiness is another. We're beginning to appreciate that uncertainty and complexity are fundamental features of our world, not as something to be fetishized, but as a reality to be recognized. This brings me back to my conversation with Ingrid Rieser in episode 3, where we talked about our ways of viewing time. If we are more attentive to the depth and complexity of the present moment, we might discover the potential opportunities latent within it and find a greater diversity of stories regarding yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So let's dive back into that conversation and see what we find.
Our task is to, if you like, continuously create conditions where we're continuously alert to what is going on in the present, to how our ideas of the future are shaping what we can see in the present, and then to seeing what is coming out of it, to see what it is that we are making. And also to know that as we bring different people into the conversation, and as we bring different ideas of the future into the conversation, it allows us to see different things. And our job is to be kind of constantly alert to just what is going on. And to also understanding that what is going on is so complex that it is never finished, you know. What we have now is not finished. What we have now is not all that there has been and all that there will be. Underneath what we have now is a massive reservoir and resource and abundance of possibilities that have not been realised. And what I'm trying to do is to say that there is more that is possible in the world than has yet been realised. And that is both potentially completely disastrous for us as humans, but that reservoir of possibility also allows us to say things do not have to be as they are at the moment. And that's it, is underneath this present moment is such richness. And our job, if you like, is to kind of be attentive to that, to notice what's going on. And a lot of what we're trying to do with this sort of work is to kind of increase our senses, our capacity for seeing what's happening and what's emerging, and allowing that to be a resource for us, even in moments of really deep despair.
Yeah, no, I think that's super useful because it kind of connects back to something that Pella, Thiel, and I talked about in the previous episode, which was if we accept uncertainty as kind of a fundamental feature of the universe and our societies, what Pella and I talked about was how do we have agency in those situations, and act into situations without trying to control them in a way.
Yeah, I mean, the world is not completely uncertain. I mean, there are certainties, there are continuities, there are solidarities that we can create. So one of the things that we decide to do, you know, when you choose to marry somebody, for example, is you make a promise. And you say, I will be with you for thick and thin, rich or poorer, you know, better, worse, all of that sort of stuff. And a promise is one of the ways of building solidarity or certainty in an uncertain world. And it always comes with limits. You can't guarantee that you can fulfill that all the time, but it's a commitment. And so that's one form of certainty we can think about. We can also think about the certainties of kind of tendencies, and the tendencies of changes historically can be to make life much, much worse for the most vulnerable, for example. So if we know that that is a tendency of radical change, then that's a space that we can start to work, and we can start to say, well, under these situations with these sorts of changes happening, how might we really draw attention to that, how might we work on that? So I suppose what I would caution again, we are in a radically dynamic universe that is throwing things up that we can't anticipate, but we can make commitments, we can work at different sets of scale, we can see patterns, all the time knowing that that's going to be challenged as things change.
I think that when we feel there's only one story about how we move forward, for example, business as usual, then attuning ourselves to the complexity of the present is a remedy, because there's always more to explore than we think. So let's see what we can take with us from Pat and Carrie. We talked about experimenting, about exercising discernment, about attuning ourselves to the complexity of the present, recognizing tendencies, and also choosing what commitments we make. So these are things that we can do to become better navigators and better co-narrators. As 2021 rolls around, I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunity to practice these skills. Now that the severity of climate change is generally accepted, we will need to safeguard against the barrage of false solutions to that crisis that are going to be proposed. For example, the normalization of geoengineering. They're about to start releasing mineral dust particles into the air in northern Sweden to see how well they can dim the sun, for example. The different stories around Corona also need to be sorted through. In Sweden, at least, the media narrative is so streamlined that I'm sure we're missing out on some very important aspects of the COVID conversation. But, and here's an important but, questioning the stories we as a society tell about ourselves does not mean having to discard everything anyone has ever told you as garbage. And that's the easy way out, because it's as absolutist as accepting everything you've ever been told as the only truth. So we have to do the hard work of sorting through the mess, of weaving a story that feels honest and robust. And like Antonio Gramsci has said, the challenge of modernity is to live without illusions and without becoming disillusioned. So I think that's the tension we have to move within. In closing, let's return to the darkness and the catacombs in Kiev. I found out that German poet Rainer Maria Rilke also visited the cave monastery more than a century before me, before writing his famous Book of Hours. Through these love poems to God, we understand that Rilke sees the darkness as a portal to spiritual enlightenment, not as an obstacle to it. He writes, "When I lean over the chasm of myself, it seems my God is dark and like a web, 100 roots silently drinking. This is the ferment I grow out of. More I don't know, because my branches rest in deep silence, stirred only by the wind." So let's pray in the dark, under the earth, feeling the stone humming secrets in the night. Let's drink and be nourished like roots in wet soil. Before the sun, the light, and the busyness start returning in full, let's take this moment to dwell in the unknown. Darkness can bring more clarity than we expect. I just wanted to end by saying that, of course, my trip to Ukraine was so much more than all of the atrocities that I just listed. It was classic ballet in epic opera houses. It was exquisitely decorated 11th century churches. It was excellent coffee. It was swims in the Black Sea and train rides across endless fields of gold. If you go there, you will see. This marks the end of our first season of The Forest of Thought. I want to thank everybody who joined us for this part of the journey, especially all of our Patreon members for their support. We're so grateful. I want to thank the Forest of Thought family Emma, Felicia, Mai, Isak for helping to make the podcast happen, for invaluable feedback and support. And of course, thank you to Christian Sten for our wonderful theme music. Season 2 will be kicking off sometime in the next couple of months. Please send me your suggestions for topics or guests. I can't wait to go exploring the Forest of Thought again with you soon. You can read more or listen back to our episodes or become a supporter by visiting forestofthought.com.